when the lights come up, I talk on that light.
It's a normal thing, isn't it, George? We're in it now, right? Valleys People, episode 6, recorded 24th of January 81, duration 30, TBA, take.
Hello and welcome again to the Valleys People. Some time ago, our first guest saw the lad in this magazine, which is published by the Australian Society of Genealogists, for someone to transcribe cemetery tombstones. And she did. And our second guest is someone who has a voice that's heard by quite a few homes right throughout the Hunter Valley. I hope you can join us today for two more interesting people, the Valleys People. Thanks for joining us today, the Valleys People. My first guest is Mrs. Doreen Homes of Kotara South, who some time ago, if I have the story correctly, apparently just saw a notice in Descent, which is the official journal of the Australian Society of Genealogists, that they were interested in people throughout New South Wales transcribing cemetery tombstones. And as Mrs. Homes had some time on her hands, or at least she thought she had, she volunteered, which I might perhaps interpolate foolishly now in hindsight, you would have thought, but I'm sure you found this most interesting. And I certainly have, Mrs. Homes, because you've been you and your team have been at work on transcribing, or actually writing out tombstone for tombstone, all the plots, the tombstone plots at Sandgate Cemetery.
That's right, yes. We started in May last year. I started on my own originally, and then gradually other members volunteered. And because at the beginning I never dreamt I would ever complete it, even alone the one denomination that I had started on. But now, 15 months later, we have completed it, and we're quite happy about the result. And
could you give me some idea of the enormity of the task? You know, how many tombstones are there at Sandgate Cemetery?
well, what we did, we only had to transcribe the actual headstones that were there. There are a lot missing on different graves, and of course a lot of graves have never been completed, but we completed 23,920 headstones.
Wow.
Which incorporated roughly 125,000 burials. We did not have access to the registers to make it a complete transcription. Hopefully the Society hoped to photocopy the registers some future date, but there would be perhaps another 5,000. That's only a rough estimate of people that are there, and of course there's a lot of headstones there where people have been recorded buried, but we have found since, with people contacting us, that a lot of people are still buried in those graves that have never been mentioned on the headstones. So.
What I find very fascinating, Mrs. Holmes, is why in the 1980s, if we're just starting this, I mean, probably a lot of people, including myself, would have imagined that you could just go to a counter somewhere or a computer printout or something, and there before you would have been all the people and all the details, everyone buried at Sandgate Cemetery. But it comes as something, I guess, as a shock to realise that if it hadn't been for yourself and a team of other people, maybe this would have never been transcribed, or at least hadn't been transcribed until now. So, you know, why? What was the problem?
Well, I don't really know. I was most surprised to find that Sandgate hadn't been done, because when I did offer, I'd really had in mind Minmai or West Wallsend, one of the small ones, Wallsend perhaps at the worst, and But whether it's organisations, it seems to be solely controlled by all the church trusts, whether that's something to do with it, like whether perhaps councils should get a record so that it's available through the councils, I really don't know. But no one has access to the registers up there, like even if you went to the caretaker and made inquiries, well, you're not shown the registers, they just seem to be private property.
So as a result of your work now, I'm just looking at one of these lists that you have, the transcriptions. You can actually now, or will be able to, maybe in book form or through the Society of Genealogists, you'll be able to find the surname and the Christian names of the people at each plot. I'm looking at John and Charlotte here for argument's sake, husband and wife. You've got the date of death, their age in years. Now, until now, that simply hasn't been available.
No, and people searching, well, unless they had any idea, well, they couldn't really get a certificate to work on their family history. But as we do it, another member is typing it, and then it's going to Sydney and being put in the files, and eventually the Society do intend to publish a book when it's all down there complete.
Now, the picture is right, isn't it? My scenario is that you have a stenographer's notebook and a pencil and pen.
Fool's cap.
Fool's cap, and you just go from plot to plot.
That's right. No prose, only the actual details, relationship.
Right. Now, in case figures sink in slowly, how many finally did you finish with? Burials?
23,920 transcriptions, and then about roughly 125,000 burials.
Yeah, were you depressed at any stage by, the conditions up there at Sandgate?
Oh, not depressed, disappointed that perhaps a little bit more care and interest isn't taken in it. Only the Roman Catholic and Church of England have caretakers working full-time, but the council, I felt, could have helped a bit more. Like, there's a terrible lot of neglect. Bottle drive would be a huge success up there, like the bottles that have been left around over the years to put the flowers in.
And smashed vases and things.
Oh yes, vandalism is very bad.
Not to say lantana and other things too are still there. So
yes,
I guess
and the Hexham Greys.
Yes, yeah, that's right. You not only did this, of course, you did it with the power of nature against you.
One time we were up there and the mosquitoes were absolutely unbelievable. None of us had ever seen them like it. We just couldn't work there, but it was an experience just to see the size. And
maybe it's the sanctity of the spirit of the dead sort of preserving their rest and peace against you. But what did people think you were doing when you were just walking along there with notebook?
Oh, well, I played it very low key. I wouldn't even tell my friends what I was doing.
Really?
Because, well, unless you're really interested in the genealogy and your family history, you don't really appreciate the value of anything like this being done. Some people came over and took an interest. You would find that some of them were up there doing research and didn't know that anything was available. Other people came along and told you the history of the people that were buried there and we were all members and we were all doing our family history and we were all very interested, and of course to us it wasn't hard work, it was interesting work, and a lot of them were, surprisingly enough, found things like with their own history that they didn't expect to find up there even.
Yes, although it's a big jump from your own family tree to every tombstone at Sandgate Cemetery, just the same.
Yes.
What sort of time was involved in that, Mrs. Holmes? You thought it was, you had a bit of time on your hands originally, so you didn't mind volunteering, but what did it end up in as an assignment?
Well, it did become very demanding because, like, when I did start, I did 2 months on my own. All my husband did then was sort of just help me with cleaning it up, because I think he thought I was wasting the time. But once you start, it sort of gets you in, and I just didn't sort of bother, where I was only going perhaps one morning a week, well, I was going 2 or 3 mornings a week after that. And then, of course, the indexing is most time consuming, and well, I enjoyed it, and I sort of don't look back on it as, I didn't even count the time or the cost which came into it.
Now, Sandgate's a very old cemetery, isn't it, from the history of Newcastle?
1881 started.
And what did you find any interesting transcriptions as you plotted through some of this undergrowth?
Oh yes, we found a lot. You know, there were people, like I'm born in Newcastle, so there were people that I'd heard of or knew of through the years. We came across the grave of the last surviving member of the Hawkesbury Aboriginal tribe. He died in Newcastle Hospital.
Has that been preserved as something as a landmark? Or?
No, it hasn't.
Oh, what a shame.
I did run into a reporter up there of Newcastle Morning Herald. He was going to contact the different organisations, and he thought the Aboriginal Trust may do something about preserving it. It has been curbed in, but it's in a rather neglected state. And then there was a prominent communist member of the Newcastle community. He's buried up there, and he had a very elaborate headstone. Another very elaborate monument was in the Presbyterian section of a young boy who died when he was 13, and apparently he was a promising violinist. And there was this statue of a boy about 3 feet high with a violin, playing the violin. Another, just a little one, was where apparently a son had erected a headstone for his mother, and she must have been a very good knitter, and there was the ball of wool and the knitting needles done into the curving around the head, like the grave.
It's still, it's still hard to comprehend that that in the 1980s, if it hadn't been for someone like yourself and a lot of willing helpers, the actual transcriptions, dates, deaths, have never ever been listed.
No, well, so many have gone astray. Like there's the old graveyard at St Andrew's Church at Mayfield. Well, that was never recorded, and that's gone now. And the old Wallsend Cemetery up on Newcastle Road, well, that fell into disrepair before much was done about it. But still, that's happened to a lot of old history of, well, Australia even, hasn't it? It's just been neglected and
yes, that's true. I
vandalised.
guess, I guess that if we didn't have this spirit 30 years ago or 40 years ago that you now have.
Well, people didn't think you'd be interested. But it is a growing hobby with people. You find they're more and more interested in family history, and of course since I started I did offer to answer queries from people. Well, I've had a terrific response, people that are hoping to find their relatives up there.
Just take me through this again. I'm fascinated. So you've been up and down every plot at Sandgate Cemetery, and you've actually written out in longhand
That's right.
all the information, except the verses and so on every tombstone. Now, this has then been indexed
That's right.
alphabetically, surname,
Yeah.
and also by a plot number.
Not plot number,
No.
transcription number.
Transcription number. And now this is preserved where now? Where does your list go?
To the Society at Richmond Villa in Sydney.
Yes. So that's available for posterity.
Oh yes,
Yes.
and it's there for people to look at now. It is progressively being typed. We have finished, but of course the typing is taking some time, and it's being progressively typed, and it goes down there and then it's available.
Well, I can see now why I should pass on the thanks to everyone in the Hunter Valley, Mrs. Holmes. That's been a fantastic story and a tremendous task, and something that I hope that's got your name on the bottom.
Oh, not really.
Because I think future generations should understand
We
that.
did it as an interest in the beginning, and now we're quite happy that people could benefit from it.
I'm sure they would have. Mrs. Doreen Homes, thank you very much for joining us today on The Valley's People.
Thank you.
I'll be back in just a moment. Our next guest is someone that maybe you've heard breakfast session in the Hunter Valley, all points of the Hunter Valley for some time now. Jeff Moore, welcome to the Valley's People, Jeff.
Thank you, Ron.
Senior announcer at the ABC and the voice that a lot of people associate with time and news and music over breakfast.
I'm very pleased to know that this is so.
Rice bubbles and Jeff Moore.
Try saying breakfast with your mouth full of rice bubbles. Oh, it's a lot of fun.
No, but you've spoken to a lot of people over a lot of years on the ABC, and as a teacher, I'm just wondering how you graduate from teaching to announcing. What's the cycle of events?
Well, it's a very long story. I won't go into the full details, but let me just say that I was more interested in the technical aspects, and I was wandering around the studios in Sydney, and one of the studio supervisors, Ralph Collins, heard me talking and suggested that I might be useful to the ABC as a casual announcer. And I said I didn't think I could do it because I was a school teacher. It turned out that after a few difficulties, yes, I was permitted to do it as a casual employee.
Now, you were teaching at Raymond Terrace and some others, weren't you?
Stroud I started.
Stroud, was it?
Yes, and then moved to Raymond Terrace with backward children. I was also teaching art at Raymond Terrace, and that was quite an experience because I love art. And then from there to Tyers Hill for 12 months, and on to the demonstration school at the Junction for 5 years. And then back to Tyers Hill as the acting assistant principal for varying periods till I left at the end of 1968 to join the ABC on a permanent basis.
That tends to give me some insight into a younger Jeff Moore. I mean by that you...
You mean I had hair?
No, I was going to say that it strikes me that you had a dedication and like a want to be a teacher, having achieved those sort of skills.
Yes, I love teaching. I still love teaching. I still think perhaps I'm a teacher at heart. Or a communicator, perhaps.
Yes, yes, yeah. You said demonstration teaching as well. What were you actively involved in there?
Well, the lecturer at the Teachers' College asked you to prepare a particular type of lesson to suit the needs of their lecture, in which you'll bring out certain points. And in the course of your lesson, you endeavour to elicit the points that they've asked you to prepare, so that there is a lesson there for the student to see. It's a difficult thing to have to do because you have to motivate the children to get those points across.
So at some stage you thought to yourself, well, if I can do that form of communication, I might have a go at announcing.
Well, no, not actually. It just happened, Ron. It was like that.
Well, take us through that phase.
Well, I was talking to Terry Cahoon, who was then the regional representative in Newcastle, and he happened to mention that they needed a part-time announcer as one had left. And I said, well, I was talking to Ralph Collins in Sydney, and I'd be perhaps interested. And he said, well, come on, we're going to audition shortly. You perhaps could be the person. Well, there were 92 auditioned. I was number 58, and I got the job.
Oh, that was good. And not only have you been announcer and friend to a lot of people in the Hunter Valley at breakfast, but you have done a stand-in stint or two in Sydney at certain
Yes,
times.
I did. Back in 1975, I worked there for about 6 weeks, presenting the 2BL breakfast show.
And perhaps a lot of people don't know in the Hunter Valley that you were offered that job full
Yes,
time.
I was. I was offered the job, and because I love Newcastle, because I love the Hunter Valley, I said no. After all, let's face the facts, the economies of it. I live 10 minutes away from work.
Yeah.
I can afford to live where I am.
Yes.
And I'm on top money anyway, so there's no point in going to Sydney.
No. Well, we're glad you stayed anyway, Jeff. Some of the things that people tell me about you I find very intriguing.
Really?
It's not necessarily your peer group, and I don't think they're people who are trying to get even either. But they tell me you're fascinated by trains.
Yes, I am. I love trains. Steam trains, diesel trains, electric trains.
You mean model trains or anything to do with
No, I mean the
locomotives?
real live thing. I mean, 4 foot 8.5 or whatever it is in centimetres. Oh, yes.
And weren't you making some crack about the flyer being late?
Yes, I was. I wasn't the only one, and it was late, and it is still running late. And so the State Rail Authority made it possible for me to go down on the flyer engine. Oh, I'd wanted to do that ever since I was a kid, you know? And one Saturday morning and come back on the midday flyer, you see? And so away I went. And what I saw opened my eyes. All the track relaying, the stanchions being built for electrification, the strengthening of the bridges, and the single line working. Obviously, your trains can't run on time with such a saturated line as the Short North when there's only one line working, you see. But coming back, I had a marvellous experience with a gentleman. And he is a gentleman. The man who drove the famous Granville train disaster engine was the driver. And we've become firm friends. How he ever managed to go back driving after the shocking experience he had, I don't know.
Blast from everywhere, didn't he?
Yes, and why he accepted me on the engine, I don't know, because being a member of the media, you may remember they didn't give him too good a time because they thought he was guilty. He wasn't.
Yes, it's great endurance to go back onto driving trains again, isn't it?
A wonderful man.
And it's fascinating that you should witness it too.
Yes.
Have a profound impression upon you.
Yes.
And not only trains, but organs, theatre organs.
Now, Ron, that's the only reason I'd like to live in Sydney, because of the old Wurlitzer theatre organs. There's still one installed in the State Theatre, and it's functioning. But I belong to a society, the Theatre Organ Society of Australia, that, with my few pence, has purchased 2 theatre organs, and one is installed and functioning at Marrickville. The other, that's the old Prince Edward organ, by the way, and the other is the old Capital Wurlitzer, and that is stored away and being refurbished at the moment. I'd love to be in Sydney, where I could do a lot more work in helping to restore these beautiful old instruments.
Have you played a Wurlitzer of that size, Jeff? Or
Yes.
You have?
I have indeed. Not well, because there's an acoustic delay. When you play the console and the pipes are something like 30 metres away from you, there is that delay in sound. You find you're getting slower and slower and slower, and you come to a dead stop. But incidentally, I did enjoy the interview you did with Rupert Hayes, who was one of the finest of the Sydney theatre organists.
Great organist.
Great
yes.
organist, yes.
There he is up at Salamander Bay, and one of the world's great cinema organists, isn't
Oh,
he?
indeed. Oh, yes.
That's incredible, Jeff, that someone who maybe people would take at face value, that is saying it's 20 past 7, it's 21 minutes past 7, it's 22 minutes past 7 every
Yes.
morning, can in fact have an interest in trains and theatre organ.
Yes.
Not that it's necessarily too oblique, but I mean it is a fascination when people just imagine you as an announcer. You think teaching has helped you in this? School
Indeed,
teaching?
I do. Well, you had to learn to communicate as a teacher. And you had to really and truly like people. And I like people. I only hope people like me. And I do see that there was the communication aspect. I'd rather be called a communicator than an announcer.
There are some people call you a giggler.
Well,
They seem to remember a couple of news bulletins.
yes, I'm afraid I have. You're a rotten cow.
No, it's fair game.
All right,
Anyone
that's all right,
laughs
yeah.
in the middle of a news bulletin.
Yes, well, it concerns a story about a fire engine in the Upper Hunter. And it was called out, you see, on a fire call. And the news item was going along quite sedately, and it just happened to point out that when they went to switch the siren on, it didn't function. When they got out to examine the position, they discovered that the siren was missing. And I had a vision as I was reading the story of someone sort of saying, "Hey, Bert, someone's nicked the siren." But that wasn't all there was to it, because I heard this loud laugh from the control room, and when I looked up there, you know, sort of out of the side of my eye,
Yes.
there was one of our technicians, who shall remain nameless, with a fire extinguisher on his shoulder and the nozzle pointing straight down through the control room window at me. That was the end of it, mate.
Yeah. That's like, you talk about newsreaders laughing. That's a famous story in the trade of James Dibble, the ABC newsreader, just packing it in one day. Maybe you can tell the story, you know.
Oh, poor old Jim. Yes, it concerned a rather sad occurrence, an air crash in Hawaii. And the story went something like 68 bodies had been taken from the wreckage, and they were going to retrieve the remaining 86 charred bodies, you know, so on and so on. The next story said, an end is seen to Sydney's meat shortage. That was the end of Jim.
Yeah. Yes. Isn't it pleasant being a critic? Jeff, thanks very much. Well, thank you really, quite sincerely, on the way that you can to get the house moving in the mornings on Breakfast Session ABC. And thanks for being our guest today on The Valley's People.
Thank you, Ron.
I'll be back in just a moment.